In today's world of just absolute information overload, you are constantly bombarded with these tiny fragments of data.
Constantly. It's overwhelming.
Right. Like you open your phone and you are getting a headline about quantum physics and then a think piece about the hard problem of consciousness.
Yeah, and then immediately after that, some furious debate about free will.
Exactly. Yeah. Or, maybe a theological argument. And this is all within the span of about 3 minutes where you're just waiting in line for coffee.
Right, just trying to get your morning latte.
Yeah. And we're all constantly trying to synthesize this stuff. We're trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality and of consciousness and, well, our specific place in this incredibly complex universe.
It's a massive cognitive load for anyone.
It really is.
Yeah.
But what if the ultimate theory of everything, like a system that attempts to tie all of those massive head-spinning concepts together perfectly, what if that was already written in the year 1714?
That is the crazy part.
Right. And even more astonishingly, what if it was written in a text scarcely longer than a modern academic journal article?
It's just wild. It is arguably one of the most audacious, compressed masterpieces in the entire history of Western philosophy.
Absolutely.
We are talking about a complete metaphysical system, a cosmology, a philosophy of mind, a philosophical theology, and, a moral vision. And all of it is meticulously packed into just 90 paragraphs.
90 paragraphs.
Yeah.
That is what, roughly 6,000 words?
Yeah, about that.
Which is mind-blowing when you consider the sheer weight of what he's attempting to do. So our mission for today's deep dive is an exploration of that exact text. We are talking about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz's Monadology.
A truly incredible piece of work.
It really is. We're going to decode this puzzle box. We want to understand exactly how Leibniz managed to synthesize the cutting-edge mechanistic science of his day with ancient theology and the philosophy of mind.
Right, because he's pulling from so many different traditions.
Yeah. But to really grasp the magnitude of this text, we cannot look at it in a vacuum because the intellectual landscape of the 17th and early 18th centuries was just incredibly messy, right?
Oh, messy is an understatement. I mean, if we want to understand the Monadology, we really have to step into the philosophical crisis that Leibniz inherited.
Okay, set the stage for us. Where are we?
So the time frame of the writing is between 1712 and September of 1714. He's in Vienna, and Leibniz is nearing the very end of his life at this point.
He's an older guy by now.
Yeah, he's a man who has spent decades serving courts, acting as a diplomat, a mining engineer, and, developing calculus independently of Isaac Newton.
Just casual side projects.
Right, exactly. And he's corresponding with the greatest minds of Europe. But the backdrop here is that the scientific revolution had completely upended the medieval scholastic worldview.
Everything was changing.
Completely. And the central crisis, basically the bleeding wound of 17th century philosophy, was essentially a crisis of substance and causality. And this was primarily left behind by René Descartes.
Okay, let's unpack this Cartesian mess, because that's really the foundation of everything Leibniz is trying to fix. Descartes basically splits the universe down the middle.
He does. Descartes bequeathed to the philosophical world a strict dualism.
Right.
He argued that reality is divided into two entirely separate kinds of substance. So on one side, you have extended substance, or res extensa.
And that's just physical matter.
Right, exactly. This is matter. Things that take up space, have shape, can be divided, like bodies, rocks, trees, and, mechanical gears.
Okay, and the other side?
On the other side, you have thinking substance, or res cogitans. This is mind, spirit, or soul. It has no physical dimensions, doesn't take up space, and it cannot be divided.
So Descartes gives us the classic mind-body problem, the ghost in the machine.
Yes, the classic formulation.
And the glaring, terrifying question that Descartes could never adequately answer was, well, if my mind is a completely non-physical thinking thing floating outside of physical space, and my body is a purely physical, mechanical thing governed by the laws of physics, how on earth do they talk to each other?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. How does a non-physical thought like, I want to raise my arm, cause physical muscles and bones to move against gravity? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't. And Descartes famously tried to solve this by pointing to the pineal gland in the brain.
Oh, right, the pineal gland.
Yeah, he suggested it was the one place where the soul could somehow nudge the quote-unquote animal spirits of the body.
Which is just such a funny image.
It really is.
Yeah.
But even his contemporaries knew this was a terrible answer. I mean, if the mind can push a physical gland, it must have physical force.
Right, which contradicts the very definition of a non-physical mind.
Exactly. So Descartes left this massive, unresolved gap in reality. And then stepping into that gap, you have Baruch Spinoza.
Oh boy. And Spinoza takes one look at this dualistic nightmare and decides to go in the absolute opposite direction.
He really does. Spinoza introduces a radical monism that frankly terrified the religious and philosophical establishments of his time.
Because he basically says it's all one thing.
Exactly. He claims that there aren't two substances. There aren't even many substances. There's only one single substance in the entire universe, and that substance is God.
Wow.
And Spinoza essentially equates God with nature itself. Everything that exists is just a modification of this one infinite substance.
So both thought and physical extension are just different attributes of this one giant infinite reality.
Precisely.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. So Descartes gives us the ghost and the machine completely separated, which makes interaction impossible?
Correct.
And then Spinoza gives us one giant, inseparable blob of reality where everything is just a manifestation of God, which, essentially destroys human individuality and free will, right? It makes everything rigidly deterministic.
It absolutely does.
So where does Leibniz fit into this? He's looking at these two extremes and he's trying to find a Goldilocks solution.
He is seeking a middle path, yeah, but a highly sophisticated one. He wants to respect the multiplicity and individuality of the universe.
So he firmly rejects Spinoza's single pantheistic blob.
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
But he also needs to solve the causal interaction problem that Descartes created, so his solution is a radical pluralism.
Meaning lots of substances.
Exactly. He proposes an infinite number of immaterial, mind-like substances that are completely independent of one another.
And we also have to remember, Leibniz wasn't just a modern scientific thinker trying to fix physics. He was deeply educated in the scholastic tradition.
Oh, very much so.
His early mentor, Jacob Thomasius, really instilled in him a profound respect for ancient philosophy. So Leibniz's ambition here is wildly synthetic.
It's massive.
He is trying to bridge the modern mechanistic mathematical science of the 17th century with the ancient teleological traditions of Aristotle, Plato, and the scholastics. Like, he wants to save the idea of souls and purpose while keeping the rigorous mathematics of the new science.
Yeah. And this crowning synthesis of his thought was written almost casually, which is the craziest part.
Wait, casually? How so?
Well, the text was requested by Nicolas Francois Raymond, a counselor to the Duke of Orleans, who simply wanted some clarification on Leibniz's doctrine.
He just wanted a quick explainer.
Right. There is even historical evidence suggesting it might have been intended as a framework for a Latin poem by an acquaintance of Raymond's.
You're kidding. A poem?
Yeah. Yet, despite the sheer brilliance of the work, Leibniz kept it in his desk. He polished the French text meticulously. We actually have 3 surviving manuscripts with his careful corrections, but it wasn't published during his lifetime.
That is just wild to me.
The original French didn't see the light of day until 1840.
The man writes a definitive theory of the universe and just files it away in a drawer. Unbelievable.
It really is.
Okay, so to solve this crisis left by Descartes and Spinoza, to bridge ancient theology with modern mechanics, Leibniz introduces a concept that is entirely his own, the fundamental building block of his entire universe. And it sounds incredibly sci-fi. He calls it the monad.
Yes, the monad. He defines it in the very first paragraph of the text. A monad, he says, is a simple substance that enters into composites.
Simple substance.
And we have to be extremely careful with his terminology here. By simple, he does not mean easy to understand.
Right, definitely not that.
He means it has absolutely no parts. It is strictly indivisible. He calls them the true atoms of nature and the elements out of which everything else is made.
But wait, a modern listener hears the word atom and immediately thinks of protons, neutrons, and electrons. Even the ancient Greek philosopher Democritus thought of atoms as tiny, indestructible, but still physical pebbles. Leibniz isn't talking about physical pebbles, is he?
Not at all, because think about it. If it is physical, if it has any size whatsoever, it can theoretically be divided into a left half and a right half.
Right.
Therefore, it is not truly simple. Leibniz's monad is more akin to a mathematical point in geometry. It has a location, perhaps, but 0 dimensions. It is immaterial.
Okay, but how does he logically prove they exist? I mean, you can't just declare that the universe is made of invisible, dimensionless, partless things without backing it up.
His proof is a marvel of deductive reasoning. It's known as the argument from composites. Leibniz points to a very undeniable observable fact, which is that composite things exist.
Okay.
And a composite thing is, by definition, just a collection or an aggregate of simpler things.
Like a Lego castle. If I am holding a Lego castle, I know for an absolute fact that it must be made of smaller, individual Lego bricks, even if I can't see the seams.
Exactly.
If the composite exists, the simple components must exist.
The Lego castle is a great visual starting point, but here is where human intuition breaks down and where Leibniz forces us to go further. A Lego brick still has a top and a bottom.
Right, it can be melted down or snapped in half.
Exactly. Leibniz argues that if you keep zooming in, you must eventually hit rock bottom. If there were no truly simple substances, there could be no composite substances, because a composite is literally nothing more than a collection of simples.
It makes logical sense.
You can't have an infinite regression of composites made of composites made of composites, because eventually there has to be a thing that is being collected. Therefore, the simple substances, the monads, must be real.
So the logic tracks. Composites demand simples. But because these monads are simple and have absolutely no parts, Leibniz derives some completely mind-bending physical consequences from this, doesn't he?
Oh, he really does.
He says that because they have no parts, monads cannot have extension. They do not take up space, they have no shape, and they cannot be split or divided.
And that lack of physical parts leads to an even more profound conclusion about creation and destruction. Leibniz argues that because a monad has no parts, it cannot go out of existence naturally.
Wait, naturally?
Yeah, think about how things decay or die in the physical world. A tree rots, a body decomposes, a machine breaks down. This happens because their constituent parts separate and rearrange.
Oh, I see.
But if you have no parts, you can't fall apart.
You are literally immune to entropy.
Precisely. And for the exact same reason, they cannot come into existence naturally because they cannot be assembled piece by piece in a factory or a womb.
So if they can't be built and they can't be destroyed by any natural process in the physical universe, how do they get here?
Leibniz argues that they can only be created or annihilated instantaneously all at once by God.
Just a sudden poof.
Basically, yes. This means that the ultimate constituents of reality are fundamentally immortal. They exist purely insofar as God sustains them.
And this brings us to paragraph 7, which contains perhaps the most famous and frankly the most heavily debated quote in the entire Monadology. Leibniz declares, monads have no windows through which anything could come in or go out.
The windowless doctrine. It sounds like a piece of poetic mysticism, but it is actually a rigorous, inescapable mechanical rule for him.
How so?
Well, because a monad has no parts, there is nothing inside it that can be physically rearranged. There is no internal motion that can be started, steered, sped up, or slowed down by an outside force.
I really want to focus on the mechanics of this. Why does having no parts mean nothing can affect it from the outside?
Because of how Leibniz and his entire scientific generation understood physical causation. Think about Cartesian mechanics. If you hit a billiard ball with another billiard ball, the second ball moves.
Right.
Why? Because the microscopic physical parts of the first ball crashed into the physical parts of the second ball, transferring kinetic energy through resistance and rearrangement. Causation is the rearrangement of parts.
But if an entity has zero parts, there's nothing for the cue ball to hit. There's no surface area to strike, no internal gears to turn.
Exactly. No external physical force can alter its interior. No created thing can causally influence a monad.
That is just so counterintuitive.
It is. And he firmly shuts the door on the old scholastic idea of accidents, too.
What are accidents in this context?
The scholastics believed in properties that could detach from substances. For example, they thought the heat of a fire was an accident that could migrate out of the fire and enter a piece of iron.
So the property literally travels.
Right. And Leibniz calls this idea of properties strolling about outside of substances pure philosophical rubbish. Neither substance nor accident can come into a monad from the outside.
Okay, I have to push back here because this is where my brain starts to reject the premise entirely. If a monad has no parts, no size, no shape, and it absolutely cannot be affected by anything on the outside, isn't it basically just a void?
That's a fair question.
Isn't it nothing? If it can't be bumped, moved, or altered by the world around it, how does anything in the universe actually happen?
That is the essential question. By accepting the scientific premise of his day that physical change is just parts moving, Leibniz paints himself into a corner where his fundamental building blocks cannot change from the outside.
Right. He's trapped by his own rules.
But he isn't blind. He knows things change. We observe a vibrant, chaotic, constantly shifting universe. So if change cannot be induced externally, Leibniz makes a radical, brilliant move. He shifts the entire burden of change to the inside of the monad.
Oh, wow.
The monad must be the source of its own internal alterations.
Which means we have to figure out what is going on inside this dimensionless point.
Yeah.
Because if they can't be changed from the outside, the answer to reality has to be internal.
Right. And to explain that, Leibniz argues that monads absolutely must have internal qualities. If they didn't have qualities, he says, they wouldn't be real things at all. They would just be empty concepts. Furthermore, if they didn't differ from one another in their qualities, there would be no detectable changes in the world of composite things.
Because if every monad was exactly identical, any rearrangement of them would just result in a universe that looked exactly the same from moment to moment.
Exactly.
So variety in the macro world requires variety in the micro world.
Mm-hmm.
But he takes it a step further than just saying some monads are different from others. He establishes one of his most famous logical laws, the principle of the identity of indiscernibles.
Yes. Leibniz states that in nature, no two things can be perfectly alike. Between any two things, there must exist an internal difference.
Wait, any two things?
Any two things. If two things share all the exact same internal qualities, they are not two things. They are the exact same single thing.
But wait, if I'm holding two brand new factory-pressed billiard balls, they seem perfectly identical. They have the same weight, the same color, the exact same internal molecular structure. But they are clearly two different things, because one is in my left hand and one is in my right hand. They are discernible by their location in space, even if their internal qualities are identical. Why doesn't that refute Leibniz?
Well, you've just articulated the exact critique that Immanuel Kant would level against Leibniz in the Critique of Pure Reason.
I'm in good company then.
You are. Kant argued that Leibniz made a fundamental error by confusing sensible appearances with things in themselves. Kant pointed out that space and time provide the conditions for individuating objects. So yes, Kant argued, two internally identical spheres can exist precisely because they occupy different spatial coordinates.
So how did Leibniz, who was a genius mathematician, defend his view against that kind of obvious spatial argument?
Because Leibniz completely rejects the idea of absolute space. He actually fought a bitter intellectual war over this with Samuel Clarke, who was defending Isaac Newton's view.
Newton thought space was absolute, right?
Right. Newton believed space was a giant, absolute, empty container that objects sit inside, existing independently of the objects. Leibniz thought that was absurd. For Leibniz, space is merely an illusion created by the relational properties between monads.
Just an illusion.
Space is just the order of coexisting things. Since space isn't a fundamental reality for him, it's just a relationship, you cannot use spatial location as a defining internal characteristic of a substance. Therefore, the difference must be internal.
Okay, so every single monad has its own unique internal fingerprint. But what is that fingerprint actually made of? If it's a simple, partless thing, how can it possess a complex inner state?
Leibniz gives us two crucial concepts to explain this internal life: perception and appetition. He defines a perception as a passing state that incorporates and represents a multitude within a unity.
Hold on, a multitude within a unity. How can a unity with no parts hold a multitude? That sounds like a contradiction.
This is where we have to abandon physical thinking and embrace informational or mental thinking. Even though a monad has no physical parts, it contains a plurality of states, relationships, and representations of the universe.
Let me try an analogy here to see if this makes sense mechanically. It's almost like a digital zip file on a computer.
Okay, I like where this is going.
A zip file has no physical dimensions in the macroscopic sense, like you can't measure its length or width with a ruler on the screen. But internally, it contains a massive compressed representation of data. It holds a multitude of information, images, text, code, within a single unified digital entity.
That analogy works exceptionally well, especially if we push it further. The monad is the ultimate zip file, compressing the data of the entire universe into a single point.
Wow.
But a zip file just sits there. The monad is active. And that is where his second concept comes in, appetition. If perception is the compressed data in the file, then appetition is the internal execution software running the program.
It's the extraction algorithm.
Exactly. Appetition is the internal force, the inherent drive that constantly pushes the monad to transition from one perception to the next. The monad is never static. It is always striving.
Constantly updating.
Yes. It is driven by its appetition to continuously unpack new states of perception, unfolding its internal programming moment by moment.
But when we use the word perception in everyday language, we usually mean seeing, hearing, being aware. Like, I perceive the microphone in front of me. Is Leibniz saying that every single invisible, partless atom in the universe is conscious? Is my coffee mug secretly thinking?
Ah, this is a vital distinction, and it is where Leibniz launches a massive attack on the Cartesians. Leibniz introduces a strict foundational difference between perception and apperception.
Apperception.
Yes, apperception is conscious awareness. It is the reflexive knowledge of one's own internal state. Perception, on the other hand, does not require awareness at all. It is simply the representation of the external within the internal.
So the monads in my coffee mug are perceiving, but they aren't aware that they are perceiving.
Precisely. And Leibniz is widely credited here with anticipating the concept of the unconscious mind centuries before Sigmund Freud or modern psychology.
Right? Because Descartes thought that only conscious minds could be simple substances. And since animals didn't possess human reason or language, Descartes concluded animals didn't have souls. They were just mindless flesh and blood automatons reacting mechanically to stimuli.
And Leibniz says Descartes failed completely because he entirely discounted unconscious perceptions. Leibniz argues that just because we aren't consciously aware of a perception doesn't mean it isn't happening.
Do we have an example of that?
He uses the beautiful example of the roar of the ocean. When you stand on the beach and hear the roar of the waves, you are consciously aware of the total noise. But that roar is made up of millions of individual water drops crashing.
And you aren't consciously hearing each individual drop.
But you must be perceiving them unconsciously, because if you didn't perceive the tiny noise of the single drop, you couldn't possibly hear the roar of a million drops, since a million times zero is still zero.
Oh, that is brilliant.
Right. Therefore, there must be perceptions occurring below the threshold of conscious apperception. Think about when you're in a deep, dreamless sleep. Your monad, your soul, hasn't ceased to exist.
Right? You're still alive.
It is still perceiving the universe, but those perceptions are so confused, minute, and indistinct that they don't rise to the level of conscious awareness.
By locating perception inside the indivisible monad, rather than viewing it as a byproduct of complex biological machinery, Leibniz sets up one of his most famous and enduring attacks on the idea of materialism. And this is found in paragraph 17 of the text.
Yes, the famous Mill argument. It is an elegant and powerful thought experiment that targets the core of mechanistic science.
Walk us through it.
Leibniz asks us to imagine a machine, a purely physical mechanical system whose structure is supposedly responsible for producing thought, feeling, and perception.
Okay, so imagine a giant mechanical brain made of cogs, or even a modern supercomputer.
Right. Now, he says, imagine that this machine is enlarged while keeping all its relative proportions exactly the same. Enlarge it so much that you can actually walk inside it, the way you would walk into a massive windmill.
So I walk through the door of this giant mechanical brain.
And what do you see as you walk around inside? You will see cogs and levers and gears pushing against one another. You see shapes, you see physical mass, and you see motions.
Sure.
But Leibniz argues, you will never find anything in those moving gears to account for a perception. You can track a gear turning another gear all day long, calculating the torque and velocity, but you will never see a thought or a feeling or the experience of seeing the color red.
Because physical properties like mass and motion are categorically different from mental properties like subjective experience.
Exactly. Therefore, he concludes, perception and consciousness absolutely cannot be explained by mechanical principles. You have to look for them in simple substances, not in composite machines.
Okay, I have to play the modern materialist for a second, because the cognitive scientists listening are going to be pulling their hair out right now.
Bring it on.
Wouldn't a contemporary materialist just say that Leibniz is totally missing the point of emergent properties? The materialist would say that the movement of the cogs, or in our case, the firing of the electrical synapses and neurons in the brain, is the perception.
Right, the system as a whole.
Exactly. The system as a whole generates the consciousness, even if the individual neurons aren't conscious. Isn't Leibniz just assuming what he's trying to prove by stubbornly saying, well, a gear isn't a thought, so machines can't think?
The materialist objection is entirely valid, and it has been debated for 300 years since he wrote this. Leibniz's argument does rely on the assumption that perception is fundamentally irreducible to physical explanation.
What?
But we have to recognize what Leibniz has brilliantly identified here. He has articulated what modern cognitive science calls the explanatory gap, or what the philosopher David Chalmers famously coined as the hard problem of consciousness.
The idea that you can map the brain perfectly, trace every single electrical impulse, but still have zero explanation for why it actually feels like something to be alive.
Exactly. Even if a neuroscientist can map every single neuron firing when you eat a piece of chocolate, it doesn't explain the subjective, internal, qualitative experience of the taste of chocolate.
It just tells you the mechanics.
Right. Leibniz gives us a fantastic negative argument against materialism. He shows why mechanical explanations feel completely insufficient for consciousness. But critics rightly point out that his positive argument, that monads do it because they possess magical internal representations, is purely stipulative.
He just declares it.
He essentially just defines monads as things that perceive, which doesn't really explain the mechanism of perception any better than the gears do.
Still, it's wild that he's outlining the hard problem of consciousness in 1714. Now, if every monad has perception, as he claims, we need to clarify something. Does that mean every single monad in the universe is basically a human mind? Is the universe just infinite human souls?
No, and this is where he structures the universe to account for the diversity of nature. Leibniz outlines a strict hierarchy of monads, divided into 3 tiers, based entirely on the clarity and distinctness of their internal perceptions.
Okay, let's start at the bottom.
At the very bottom, you have what he calls bare monads, or mere monads.
What's their inner life like?
They have perception and appetition, but their perceptions are incredibly confused and indistinct. Leibniz compares it to a permanent swoon, or a deep, dreamless sleep.
Just totally out of it.
Or, as he vividly describes it, the feeling you get when you spin around in circles continually until you are dizzy and all your senses just blur into a confused rush where you can't distinguish anything.
Wow.
That is the constant, eternal state of a bare monad. They form the basic building blocks of inorganic matter.
Okay, so the wooden table I'm sitting at is made of a colony of bare monads locked in a perpetual unconscious dizzy spell. What is the next tier up?
The next tier are souls. These are monads whose perceptions are more distinct, and crucially, they are accompanied by memory. This is where animals exist in Leibniz's hierarchy. Because they have memory, they are capable of what he calls a following from, which mimics reason.
So they can learn from habit.
Yes, he calls them empirics. They act strictly on habit and association. He uses the example of a dog. If you show a stick to a dog, the dog remembers the pain of being hit by a stick previously and it whines or runs away.
Right.
The dog isn't doing abstract logical deduction about the physical properties of the stick and the kinetic energy it can impart. The dog is just linking past intense perceptions to current ones. And Leibniz dryly notes that humans operate as mere empirics in about 3/4 of what we do.
This is so true.
We expect the sun to rise tomorrow simply because it always has, not because we've calculated the celestial mechanics.
We are mostly just dogs running from sticks. But there is a top tier, right? The fraction of the time when we aren't just acting on blind habit.
Yes. The highest kind of monads are rational spirits, or minds. This is us. What distinguishes a rational spirit from an animal soul is not just memory, but the knowledge of necessary and eternal truths.
Which means we can do math.
Exactly. This knowledge gives us reason, the capacity for science, and the ability for self-reflection. We have an awareness of the I. We can think about our own existence, about substance, and ultimately we have the capacity to know God.
So we have the unique capacity to know eternal truths. Which means we need to look at the operating system Leibniz installs in the universe to process these truths. We have to look at the 2 great principles that govern his entire philosophical architecture, because everything he builds rests on these 2 logical pillars.
These 2 principles are the absolute bedrock of his logic. The first is the principle of contradiction. This simply states that whatever involves a contradiction is false, and whatever is opposed to the false is true. It is the basis of all logical deduction.
Basic binary logic. If a statement contradicts itself, it's inherently false.
And this principle applies to what Leibniz calls truths of reasoning. These are necessary truths, like mathematics or geometry. A triangle must have 3 sides. 2 + 2 must equal 4.
It can't be any other way.
Right. The opposite is logically impossible. It would contain a contradiction. You can analyze these truths down to their basic, undeniable axioms.
But the other kind of truth is much messier, because it deals with the real world, not just abstract math.
Right. Those are truths of fact. These are contingent truths. For example, the fact that you and I are sitting here analyzing the Monadology right now, it's happening, it's true, but its opposite was entirely possible.
Yeah, I could be asleep right now.
We could have chosen to discuss Spinoza's ethics instead. It wouldn't violate the laws of logic if we had made a different choice.
So for contingent truths, how do you logically explain them? This is where his second great pillar comes in, right?
Yes, the principle of sufficient reason. This principle states that no fact can be true or exist, and no statement correct, unless there is a sufficient reason why things are exactly as they are and not otherwise.
Even if we don't know the reason.
Exactly. Even if we humans don't know what that reason is, a sufficient reason must exist.
Everything happens for a reason, but elevated from a comforting cliché to a fundamental law of physics and logic. But how does that work in practice? If I ask for the sufficient reason why we are discussing Leibniz today, I could say, well, because you and I agreed to do it. But then you have to ask why we agreed.
Right.
Because we both find 17th century rationalism fascinating. Why? Because of our educational backgrounds. Why? It just keeps going backwards forever.
And that infinite regression is exactly Leibniz's point. For contingent truths, the analysis is infinite. The sequence of prior events and tiny inclinations goes back forever, dividing into ever more minute details.
It never ends.
You can trace the chain of causes back endlessly through the history of the universe, back to the Big Bang, essentially, but you will never, ever find the ultimate sufficient reason within that contingent chain itself. Every fact just points to another contingent fact.
So the chain of cause is just suspended in midair. It needs a hook to hang on.
Exactly. The ultimate sufficient reason for the whole infinite sequence of contingencies must lie outside the sequence itself. It must lie in a necessary substance, a substance that carries the reason for its own existence within itself, rather than relying on a prior cause.
Although I see where this is going.
And this necessary substance, Leibniz concludes, is God.
So this is his logical pathway to proving God exists. It's not based on faith, it's based on the demands of logic. The universe is full of contingent facts. They demand a sufficient reason. The reason can't be found in the facts themselves. Therefore, a necessary being must exist outside the facts.
Yes. That is his a posteriori proof, also known as the cosmological argument. He moves from the observed facts of the universe to the logical necessity of God. But, as a rationalist, he also offers an a priori proof, an ontological argument, which relies purely on concepts without needing to look at the physical world.
How does the ontological argument work? Because these always feel a bit like word magic to me.
It builds on the tradition of Anselm and Descartes, but Leibniz adds a crucial step. Leibniz argues that God is a supreme being with no limits, containing all positive reality and perfection. Now, Leibniz says because this concept of an unlimited, perfect being involves no internal contradictions, unlike a square circle, it is logically possible.
Okay, so a perfect being is possible, no contradictions.
And here's the logical trap he sets. For a necessary being, the mere fact that it is possible is sufficient for it to be actual.
Wait, what?
Think about it. If a necessary being could possibly exist but doesn't, then it wouldn't be necessary. It would be contingent. Therefore, since the concept of God is possible and God is defined as necessary, God must actually exist.
Okay, my brain just did a backflip. He defines God as necessary, proves God is possible, and therefore existence is mandatory. But philosophers tore this apart later, right?
Yeah.
Didn't Kant dismantle this entirely?
Kant absolutely demolished it. In his critique of the ontological argument, Kant famously pointed out that existence is not a predicate.
What does that mean mechanically? What is a predicate in this context?
A predicate is a property or characteristic that adds to the description of a concept. If I have the concept of a triangle, I can add predicates like it is red or it is large. But Kant argued that saying it exists doesn't add anything to the concept itself.
Oh, I see.
A concept of 100 imaginary dollars contains the exact same properties as a concept of 100 real dollars. You can't just define something as having all perfections, claim that existing in reality is a perfection, and thereby define it into physical existence. You can't logically think God into reality by manipulating definitions.
But regardless of Kant's later teardown, for Leibniz, God is firmly established as the necessary anchor of reality. So what does this all mean for God's role in this universe of windowless monads? Is God just a master clockmaker who winds up the universe and walks away?
God is far more integral and active than that. God is the original, uncreated, simple substance, and God has three primary attributes: power, knowledge, and will. What's deeply fascinating here is how these macro attributes mirror the microstructure of the created monads. Well, God's power corresponds to a monad's basic subject or nature. God's knowledge, which contains all possible ideas, corresponds to a monad's perception. And God's will, which chooses the best outcome, corresponds to a monad's appetition.
So the fundamental building blocks of reality are made in the exact image of the operating system.
Quite literally. And God is constantly sustaining the universe. Leibniz uses a beautiful, haunting phrase here. He says that all created monads are generated moment to moment by continual flashes of silent lightning from the divinity.
Flashes of silent lightning.
God is radiating reality into existence at every second.
That is gorgeous writing for a philosophical treatise. But this brings us to a massive, agonizing question. If God has all this infinite power, absolute knowledge, and perfect will, why on earth did he create this specific world? A world with childhood leukemia, devastating earthquakes, cruelty, and war. If he is perfect, why not create a perfect world?
Leibniz tackles this head-on with what is known as the principle of the best. He argues that within God's infinite understanding, there exists an infinite number of possible universes. Different timelines, different laws of physics, different histories.
Like the multiverse.
Exactly. But since only one universe actually exists, ours, the principle of sufficient reason demands that God must have had a reason to choose this specific one over all the infinite others.
And since God is perfect, that reason must be perfect.
Precisely. His wisdom knows the best world, his goodness chooses it, and his power creates it. Therefore, by strict, inescapable logical deduction, this universe, exactly as it is with all its apparent flaws, must be the best of all possible worlds.
But what is the criteria for best? Because best to a human usually means least amount of suffering or maximum happiness.
And that is the human fallacy, according to Leibniz. He has a very specific, almost mathematical metric for perfection. For him, the best world is the one that achieves the greatest possible variety combined with the greatest possible order.
Variety and order.
It is about maximizing the richness and diversity of phenomena while maintaining perfectly elegant, simple laws of physics.
It's an aesthetic and mathematical perfection, not a human comfort perfection.
Exactly. This is his theodicy, his attempt to justify God's goodness in the face of the existence of evil. Leibniz argues that what we perceive as evil or suffering is merely a necessary shadow required for a greater systemic good. A world without that specific shadow, a world without that specific suffering, might be easier for humans, but it would have less variety or less elegant order, making it overall less mathematically perfect in the eyes of God.
I can hear Voltaire laughing aggressively from the 18th century.
Yeah.
Because Voltaire famously savaged this exact idea in his satirical novel Candide.
He absolutely destroyed it.
He has the character Dr. Pangloss wandering through earthquakes, shipwrecks, and brutal torture, constantly repeating that everything is for the best in this best of all possible worlds. It feels incredibly callous to look at horrific human suffering and say, well, don't worry, it maximizes the variety-to-order ratio.
It is deeply morally troubling, and it's why the American pragmatist William James would later criticize Leibniz deeply. James argued that Leibniz's system was divorced from lived human experience, prioritizing abstract logical tidiness over the very real, visceral reality of suffering. But for Leibniz, it is an inescapable logical conclusion of his system. If God is perfect, this world must be the optimal calculation.
And this brings us to how this optimal calculation actually functions mechanically.
Mm-hmm.
The million-dollar question we deferred earlier, the mind-body problem. Let's revisit this because this is where the rubber meets the road.
Okay, let's do it.
If my mind is a windowless monad and my body is a collection of windowless monads and they absolutely fundamentally cannot physically interact with each other, why does my physical arm raise in the air the exact second my mental mind decides I want to raise it?
This is where Leibniz introduces his most famous and perhaps most bizarre solution. The doctrine of pre-established harmony. Remember, he has already rejected Descartes' interactionism. The non-physical ghost cannot force the physical machine to move. And he also rejects a competing theory of the time called occasionalism.
What was occasionalism?
Thinkers like Nicholas Malebranche argue that since mind and body can't interact, God has to constantly intervene. Every single time you want to raise your arm, God notices your mental desire and miraculously moves your physical arm for you.
That seems exhausting for God.
Leibniz thinks that is incredibly messy and entirely unworthy of a perfect God. A perfect engineer doesn't need to constantly tinker with his machine to keep it running.
So what's his answer?
God did a one-time programming at the dawn of creation. Leibniz says that the mind follows the laws of final causes. It operates on appetites, desires, and goals. The body, meanwhile, follows the laws of efficient causes. It operates on strict mechanics and physics.
Two separate tracks.
These are two completely separate, parallel tracks that never touch. But because God is perfect and calculated the best possible world, He synchronized these two tracks perfectly at the very beginning of time.
Let me make sure I understand the terrifying implications of this. It's like having two perfectly synchronized clocks ticking in different rooms.
Yes, the clock analogy.
They strike 12 at the exact same moment, they aren't causing each other to strike, and nobody is running between the reams adjusting them. They were just built perfectly by a master clockmaker so they would always align.
That is the exact analogy Leibniz himself often used. There is no real physical influence between your mind and your body. There is only an ideal influence coordinated by God. When God created your mind monad, he looked at all the other monads that make up your physical body, and he synchronized their mechanical destiny perfectly with your mental destiny.
Okay, I have to stop you. That is logically pristine, but it is phenomenologically insane. It means that when I decide to take a sip of coffee right now, my physical body was already mechanically destined to reach for the mug at this exact second since the Big Bang.
Correct.
And my mind just happened to play the internal I want coffee perception at the exact matching timestamp. It means I have absolutely zero free will. I'm just a meat puppet watching a movie of my own life.
You have hit on the most profound tension in the Monadology. It is a profound, terrifying determinism wrapped in an illusion of agency. Leibniz tries to defend free will by saying your actions flow from your own internal nature. You aren't being coerced by outside forces because you are windowless. You act according to your own internal script.
But yes, that script was written and finalized by God before you were born.
Exactly.
That is heavy. And it expands beyond just me and my body, doesn't it? Because every single monad in the universe has to be synchronized with every other monad for this to work.
Exactly. Leibniz says that because of this universal synchronization, every single monad is a perpetual living mirror of the universe.
How can a tiny, partless, dimensionless dot mirror the whole universe?
Think of a complex city viewed from different angles. It is the exact same city, but the perspective changes entirely depending on where you stand.
Right.
Every monad represents the exact same unified universe, but from its own unique individual point of view. It represents the things closest to its body distinctly, and things far away confusedly, fading into infinity. The universe is not a single objective physical space. It is an infinite collection of subjective perspectives on a single, perfectly synchronized reality.
Which means we need to look at how Leibniz envisions the physical layout of this cosmos, because this pre-established harmony is playing out on a canvas that Leibniz envisions in a very specific, almost claustrophobic way.
Yes, Leibniz completely rejects the idea of a vacuum or empty space. For him, the universe is a plenum. It is completely full, densely packed with matter and monads.
No empty space at all.
Because it is completely full, everything is physically interconnected in a chain reaction. If you throw a pebble into the ocean, the ripples ultimately affect the entire universe, however distantly, because matter is constantly displacing other matter.
It's like a cosmic waterbed. You push down on one side and the whole thing shifts. Because there is no empty space to absorb the shock, every movement translates through the entire medium. Everything is connected.
A cosmic waterbed is a great visual for a plenum, and within this densely packed waterbed, Leibniz looks at living bodies. He calls them divine machines or natural automatons. But he makes a crucial, fascinating distinction between a human-made machine, like a brass watch, and a divine machine, like an animal.
What's the difference? Mechanically speaking, a gear is a gear, right?
Not to Leibniz. If you take apart a human-made brass watch, you find gears. If you break the gears, you eventually get to a piece of unshaped brass. The machine stops being a machine at the microscopic level. It's just dumb, dead metal. But nature's machines, divine machines, are machines down to infinity. There is infinite folding.
Like fractals. It's turtles all the way down.
Exactly. Leibniz was heavily influenced by the early microscopes of his time. People like Antony van Leeuwenhoek were just discovering bacteria and spermatozoa.
Oh, wow. The timing makes perfect sense.
Leibniz takes this discovery and extrapolates it to infinity. He argues that every drop of fluid, every portion of matter, every part of an animal is itself a garden full of plants or a pond full of fish. And those microscopic fish, they are themselves ponds full of even smaller fish ad infinitum.
That's wild.
He literally declares there is nothing barren, sterile, dead in the universe. Every speck of dust is teeming with infinite layers of life and souls.
That is incredibly prophetic regarding microbiology, even if he takes it to a metaphysical extreme. But if everything is a machine inside a machine, what happens when we die? Do all those inner ponds just evaporate?
According to Leibniz, there is no true generation from nothing, and there is no complete death. Because of this infinite folding, souls don't just vanish, and they don't transmigrate to new bodies either, like in Hindu or Pythagorean thought.
So what do?
Instead, they undergo metamorphosis. He believed in preformation theory. Microscopic, preformed beings, which he called spermatic animals, already exist in the matter. Conception doesn't create a new life from scratch. It simply elevates an already existing spermatic animal, causing it to unenvelop, grow, and unfold onto a larger macroscopic stage.
So birth is literally just zooming in on a zip file and uncompressing it so we can see it on a larger screen.
And death is just shrinking back down. Death is the envelopment and folding back up of the divine machine. The soul never entirely leaves matter, it just recedes into a microscopic state. Only God is completely detached from matter.
Okay, so we have this infinitely dense, infinitely living, perfectly synchronized universe packed with fractal machines. But where does morality fit into this giant clockwork mechanism? Because the final paragraphs of the text take a sudden turn away from physics and into theology.
We arrive at the moral climax of the text, the city of God. Leibniz argues that while all monads mirror the physical universe, rational spirits, human minds, do something more. They are images of divinity itself.
Because of reason.
Right. Because we have reason and self-awareness, we can enter into a community with God. We relate to him not just as an inventor to a machine, but as a prince to his subjects, or a loving father to his children.
And the totality of all these rational spirits makes up this city of God.
Yes. It is a perfect moral world situated within the natural physical world. And here is where Leibniz achieves his ultimate grand synthesis. He claims that the realm of physics, the mechanical causes, and the realm of grace, the moral causes, harmonize perfectly.
How so?
Under God's perfect government, there are no unpunished sins and no unrewarded good actions. But these rewards and punishments don't require miraculous intervention from God. Because of the pre-established harmony, sins carry natural punishments built directly into the mechanical, physical structure of reality.
So the physical universe is literally rigged to bend towards moral justice over time. If you do something evil, the mechanical gears of the universe are pre-programmed to deliver your punishment naturally.
Exactly. The mechanical doings of bodies will naturally bring about the moral requirements of grace. Physics and morality are just two sides of the same perfectly synchronized coin.
When you step back and look at what Leibniz did here, moving from a spaceless, dimensionless dot to a synchronized cosmic machine to a moral theology where physics and justice are one and the same, you realize he didn't just solve Descartes' physics problem, he tried to write the source code of reality. It is a breathtaking system.
It truly is.
But historically, did this system actually hold up to scrutiny?
Historically, it faced massive pushback. We already discussed Kant's devastating teardown in the Critique of Pure Reason. Kant's core argument was that Leibniz treated human concepts of understanding, like the principle of sufficient reason or the concept of existence, as if they applied to things in themselves beyond human experience.
Right.
Kant argued we can only apply logic to what we can actually experience, the phenomena. By trying to logically deduce the nature of God or partless monads, the noumena, the hidden reality, Leibniz overstepped the bounds of human reason entirely.
He built a magnificent castle in the sky, but he used tools that only work on the ground.
Exactly. And later philosophers were equally harsh. We mentioned William James, who found the bloodless mathematical perfection of the system revolting when compared to the messy reality of human life. Bertrand Russell, one of the founders of analytic philosophy, spent his early career exposing what he saw as the internal logical contradictions of Leibniz's system, particularly his handling of relations in space.
And yet, even with those critiques, we cannot ignore the staggering prescience of this text. He theorized unconscious perception 2 centuries before Freud made it a household concept. He clearly articulated the hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap between moving parts and subjective feeling, centuries before modern cognitive science mapped the brain.
His foresight was incredible.
His vision of infinite microscopic ecosystems anticipated modern biology. Even if his metaphysical foundation is ultimately viewed as a flawed, albeit beautiful, fiction, the architecture he built on it was centuries ahead of its time.
It remains a masterpiece of systematic thinking. It forces us to ask the hardest questions about reality, causation, and our place in the cosmos.
So to kind of bring this all together for you, the listener, the learner, trying to synthesize this, let's imagine you had to take a final university exam on this. Just to solidify what we've covered, I'll throw you a classic exam question, and you give the model answer. Ready?
I am ready. Give me the exam.
Okay, question 1. Compare Leibniz's theory of substance with Descartes and Spinoza.
Model answer. Descartes gives us dualism. 2 interacting substances. mind, and matter, which creates the impossible problem of how they interact. Spinoza gives us monism, one single substance, God, which destroys individuality and free will. Leibniz gives us pluralism, an infinite number of windowless simple substances called monads, where interaction is an illusion solved by pre-established harmony.
A+. Perfect. Okay, question 2. Explain the philosophical significance of the principle of sufficient reason as the engine of the monadology.
The engine. The principle of sufficient reason states that everything must have a reason why it is thus and not otherwise. This is the engine because it forces the existence of God to explain contingent facts. It forces God to choose the best of all possible worlds because he must have a reason. And it grounds the pre-established harmony because God needs a perfect reason to synchronize the universe.
Another A+. You passed the monadology exam.
Glad to hear it.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. Leibniz built this entire magnificent universe to save morality and meaning in the face of cold, mechanistic science. But to do it, to make it all work, he created a system where every single thing you do, every thought you have, every physical movement you make, every choice you agonizingly deliberate over is completely determined by your own internal nature, perfectly pre-programmed by God from the absolute beginning of time.
The ultimate trap.
He believed this synchronization was the ultimate foundation of a moral universe. But if your windowless inner life is just flawlessly playing out a script that you cannot alter, to what extent is the you making choices really in control? Are you a free moral agent shaping the universe, or are you just a captive spectator sitting in the front row watching your own life play out on a screen in the best of all possible worlds?
That is the enduring, inescapable paradox of the monadology.
Think about that the next time you decide to raise your arm. Thank you for joining us on this conversation. Keep questioning, keep unpacking those puzzle boxes, and keep exploring the hidden foundations of reality.